Hey guys, so I made a video 4 weeks ago that's been popping off, which was about Jordan Peterson's opinions on borderline personality disorder, as Amber Heard has borderline personality disorder. And since that one did really well, and we got quite a few new subscribers from that video, thanks for joining me. Feel free to let us know in the comments down below where you're from. I thought it might be worth doing a follow-up, but this time looking at Johnny Depp's ADHD, just to be fair, you know. And obviously, I say obviously, it's not that obvious. I myself have ADHD, so I have done a bit of research on the topic, as you would imagine. And yeah, so let's jump into it. So ADHD, yeah, before we jump into Jordan, let's have a quick look at it. There's two types of ADHD, which is important to be aware of, right? There is ADHD, which includes hyperactivity, and then there's inattentive ADHD, which is the kind of ADHD I have, and I would imagine Johnny Depp has as well. It's the one where you're not hyper, and you can be very laid back, but at the same time, you can ramble a little bit sometimes when you speak, and mumble on a bit, yeah. But it's not entirely obvious that you have it, really, apart from maybe poor eye contact and a little bit of mumbling. So we'll jump into Jordan Peterson's thoughts on ADHD, and this will tell us a bit more about Johnny Depp, and then we'll go over the symptoms of ADHD that might have contributed to the relationship dynamic. So let's see what Jordan's got to say about ADHD. So we're going to start with why so many people have it in the first place. That's kind of important to know as well.
I also think that it was probably an idea that was more relevant during the mid to late stages, say, of the development of the Industrial Revolution, because to work in a factory meant something very different than to work as a peasant. First of all, if you were working in a factory, you became bound by time in a way that human beings had never been bound by time. You know, we time everything. Seconds mean something to modern people. You know, but it took a long time for the idea that time was of the essence for the organizing of human life. And a lot of that occurred as people moved into the factories. And so you can see, for example, the legacy of that in the modern pre-university school systems, because the school systems that most of you attended, with their rows of desks and their buzzers and their bells and their recesses, are basically factory structures that emerged from the Industrial Revolution that were characteristic of the way that working people who worked in factories organized their lives. So the bells that go off between periods and to announce that it's noon and to tell you that school's out, those are factory bells. And so you can see echoes of Freud's idea that the superego and the ego and the id are in conflict by imagining, for example, how difficult it is for a very active 6-year-old, especially if they're male, to sit quietly and regulate themselves by the bell for 6 or 7 hours, you know, when they first go to grade 1. And the fact that, you know, Freud would say, if he was alive, that the reason that so many people have attention deficit disorder is because the demands of the superego, so to speak, in the school system are so excessive that the clash produces pathology. Now, the pathology is obviously defined by the situation. If you define pathology as being unable to sit down and pay attention to things that are deadly boring while you should be running around playing and having fun and wearing yourself to a frazzle, then that's pathology. That's attention deficit disorder. And you can treat it with Ritalin, but that's only because you can treat anybody with Ritalin, you know, as I'm sure many of you know. So, you know, Ritalin is an amphetamine, and it makes you focus more on whatever you happen to be focused on, though there's no real evidence that it provides any boost in academic achievement over any reasonable amount of time. But if you think about it that way, you see, you can understand what Freud meant by this superego versus ego conflict, or the superego-ego-id conflict. Attention deficit disorder is a perfect example of that. And then the pathology is defined by the circumstance. If we didn't have schools that are like the schools we have, we wouldn't have attention deficit disorder as a pathology. Now, and people like to think about it as a scientific category. You know, it's a disease, and a disease is like an objective entity. It's like, well, no, it's not a disease, and it's not an objective entity. It's a sociocultural construction. However, there are certain people who are going to be more prone to be diagnosed with it than others, and that would mostly be extroverted, open extroverted kids, because they're not going to sit down and shut up because they can't. They're extremely curious, and mostly what they want to do is talk to everyone and play. Now Jack Panksepp actually, has done really interesting experiments with male rats, and he showed that if you deprive male juvenile rats of rough and tumble play, their prefrontal cortex doesn't mature, which is also a real hats off to Piaget's theory of play as critical for higher levels of development, and that you can also inhibit their tendency to play using Ritalin. So it's pretty sad. In fact, it's appalling, really. So, and I see people in my clinical practice fairly frequently who come in and said, well, they were diagnosed with ADHD when they were like 4 or whatever. It's like, great, you know. Pathetic. It's pathetic that that happens.
So basically, what we can take from that is Johnny Depp is an actor and a musician because his brain doesn't like the structure of kind of 9 to 5 work. People with ADHD, they generally, a lot of us, struggle with structure of 9 to 5 jobs and stuff, and have to kind of carve out different jobs, often in creative fields. Hence why I'm a photographer and videographer. It's quite a good way that I can choose my own hours and stuff. So we are quite a bit different. So let's go on to see what else Jordan has to say. Jordan Peterson on ADHD. Here we go.
Now my question is regarding ADHD, which is something I haven't heard you speak a whole lot about, maybe a little bit. Now it seems to me that we, or at least maybe just me, do not quite understand ADHD to what could be its full capacity maybe. And because there's many voices saying that it's an overdiagnosed, overblown, small mental variance that's prevalent in boys, or it's just young boys being young boys. And then there are some that would fight and advocate for very different treatment in the academic world. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on ADHD itself, and on whether you think it's overdiagnosed, and maybe advice for me as someone who has been diagnosed with ADHD on how to overcome it without maybe becoming completely reliant on prescribed medication.
Okay, so first of all, it's definitely overdiagnosed. Second, it's a very unreliable psychiatric diagnosis. Many psychiatric diagnoses are unreliable, and that's because psychiatric diagnoses aren't precisely scientific categories. They're weird hybrids, right? First of all, psychiatrists aren't scientists, they're engineers. Engineers are trying to do something rather than to describe the objective world, and psychiatrists are trying to make people healthy, whatever that means. It's actually partly ethical. It's very complicated. We don't know how to distinguish it from temperamental variation. So for example, if you're high in openness and high in extroversion, and low in conscientiousness, low in agreeableness, conscientiousness, and high in neuroticism, you're likely to manifest symptoms of ADHD. It's because you're exploratory, you don't like to sit down, you're full of ideas, your attention scatters across a wide variety of topics, and you're not very stable. Temperamental variation is also much more common among boys. Panksepp showed, same guy with rats, that if you deprive young rats of rough and tumble play, which is what the young boys are deprived of in school, let's say, that they get hyperactive, and then their prefrontal cortexes don't develop very well because they're not having the right kind of experiences, and that you can treat that quite effectively with psychomotor stimulants like Ritalin. So that's kind of an interesting bit of scientific information that no one pays any attention to. There is also absolutely no evidence whatsoever that long-term use of psychomotor stimulants produces increases in cognitive gain. Zero. And there's plenty of evidence that it's harmful. So then the second part of that was, what about adjustments for, in the academic world, say? That would be disability adjustments. It's like, that's such a rat's nest that I don't want to even discuss it. I mean, I'll discuss it for like 15 seconds. There is a never-ending multiplication of disabilities. That's what's happening right now. The disability offices in the universities are swamped. Like, I know some people have it rough. Like, believe me, I know that. I seriously know that. I've dealt with extraordinarily damaged people in my life. You're bloody hard-pressed to find someone who doesn't have a serious problem, or who doesn't have a serious problem in a close family member. It's like, where do you draw the line with regards to disabilities? Well, you can't. You can't. They multiply. Just like LGBT identities multiply. Just no, really, technically just like that. Just like intersectionality, categories of oppression multiply. It's inevitable. The way that you deal with it is you have objective standards. You apply them to everyone. Not because that's fair. It's not fair if your criteria for fairness is that everyone has the same outcome. It's not fair at all. It's not even close to fair. It's just less tyrannical than the alternatives. Now, we don't know that yet because we haven't seen the full range of the tyranny of the alternatives manifest itself, not in our culture, but it certainly did in other cultures. I think it's a bad idea. Now, I don't want to be absolute about that. Like, it's tricky, you know, because if you have a disability that would allow you to do the work in the university and in the workplace with a modification, then perhaps the modification could be made. But I think that was done a lot better when that was in the hands of the professors and not in the hands of these crazy bureaucratic structures that have risen up around the disability issue. Like, they're one of the 10 things that are going to kill the universities, or maybe have already killed them, possibly. Because they're walking corpses as far as I can tell. Zombies, so, and that might be wrong, but it's what it looks like to me.
So there we go, that's Jordan Peterson's opinions on ADHD. So let's take a look at the symptoms and see
Looking for music.
Let's take a look at the symptoms and see how these symptoms might affect Johnny Depp's relationship with Amber Heard. As obviously, you know, just to be fair, since we did do a deep dive into borderline personality disorder. So we're going to assume, because Johnny Depp's very laid back, like we said, he has the inattentive ADHD, which is the same one as me, where you're not hyper. So basically, let's symptoms of children and teenagers. Symptoms in adults, okay. So let's take a look and see what we can find. Carelessness and lack of attention to detail. There's that, yeah. But also, although we struggle to focus, we can hyper-focus. So we can probably learn 3 times as much as somebody else in the space of an hour by hyper-focusing. So for example, Stephen Hawking can hyper-focus. Johnny Depp will be able to hyper-focus, which is probably why he's such a talented actor. Continually starting new tasks before finishing old ones, poor organizational skills, inability to focus or prioritize until you hyper-focus, which is when you do things last minute. Or you're like super infatuated with something. Like, I love cameras, so I learned an insane amount about them in like no time. Forgetful, restless and edginess, difficulty keeping quiet. Yeah, that can be a problem. And speaking out of turn. Oh, so that can be a problem in relationships. Not being able to keep quiet and speaking out of turn. Obviously, if you're dating somebody with borderline personality disorder, that's going to get on their nerves. Quite a lot, actually, yeah. Blurting out responses and often interrupting others. Right. Not thinking through what you're saying as well in a relationship, not great. Your partner does not want you to be talking without thinking, but when you have like 6 thoughts running through your head at the same time, one of them's going to come out. So that's problematic. Mood swings, I don't get that. Irritability, a little bit maybe. Quick temper, I don't have that either. So, I mean, but it says these are symptoms. So potentially, Johnny Depp could have these symptoms. We did see him banging all the kitchen doors and stuff, so that is a mood swing. But apparently he just found out his mum died, which I suppose is fair enough. But yeah, there is that. Extreme impatience, yes. Now, you get really frustrated if you're waiting for stuff. That could be annoying for people as well. Like, waiting in queues are like almost impossible because you're stuck there when your body kind of wants to move, your brain's thinking of a million things. You basically need to create stimulation for your brain so you can focus. And if you're in a queue, no. So taking risks inactivities, often with little or no regard for personal safety. Yeah, yeah. It's very bizarre. People don't really realize just how much of a lack of danger we perceive is ridiculous. I mean, we know it's there, but we just not really care, you know. Okay, so there's that, right? But what the NHS website has actually missed out as well, which is really important. This is really important. Although mood swings, irritability, and a quick temper is listed there as well. Also, somebody with ADHD is actually far more likely to be victimized by other people as well. I think the lack of eye contact makes people think that you're maybe a little bit intimidated and scared, so they like the power. And when in reality, you're just looking for things to kind of stimulate your brain. You've just lost interest. You're looking for other things to create dopamine in your brain so you can focus. And the talking a lot, people will often think that that's nerves, when in reality it's ADHD. So if they think that you're unconfident and nervous, people will try and kind of give you shit because they feel like they're tough. When in reality, you're not scared, you're not necessarily nervous, and you have no perception of danger. So I mean, you're not the person that they think you are, but they will try and bully you. But then when that happens, when people start arguments with you, because you have 6 thoughts running through your head at once and the ability to hyper focus, when you're thinking through like what you should say, what you should do, and things like that, by the time you decide on the best like thing to say for the best possible outcome, like it's over. Like they're gone. It's done. It's way too late. So, I mean, mood swings, yes, but you're terrible at arguing. And unless you're like really angry, which takes a lot. So yeah, so I guess there is that could affect the relationship, but generally, I mean, this is something where you are more likely to be victimized, which will attract people that are wanting to victimize people, because people with this condition, they're obviously very high in honesty and openness as well, which is why they're very talkative, which makes it kind of easy for them to be taken advantage of when they're being a little too honest. So yeah, I'd say, in my opinion, this still obviously makes it very clear that Johnny Depp would be the victim, even though there is signs that he could have mood swings and irritability and a quick temper. There we go. Anyway, this video is long enough. Thanks for watching. Feel free to subscribe, and thanks for all the new subscribers for joining us over the last couple of days. There's been loads of yous, and it's appreciated. Thanks, and I'll jump back on again soon.